Um, I'm pleased and honored, and also John Wallach, and I'm here to introduce our two speakers and commentators this afternoon to discuss from various angles the topic of journalism and political knowledge. In case you need reminding, Nicholas Lemann and Peter Beinart are two of the most talented and skilled journalists and teachers of journalism in the United States today, and they're right here. The fact that there aren't more people here is just a testimony to the condition of American public discourse. Anyways, their many writings have an unusual combination of seriousness, meaning, and significance in contemporary American public discourse. I've invited them to talk at our political theory workshop on the subject of journalism and political knowledge because of my long-held view that political theory and journalism are both kinds of political writing and as such should inform each other much more than they often do. First, a bit about their professional biographies, which I guess are rightly presented in Wikipedia. I'm not sure. Anyways,
there's one thing in Wikipedia that I dispute.
Only one?
Okay. Anyways, but
get into that if you want.
so in not in alphabetical order, but in chronological order, because I'm become a great fan of the privileges of seniority. Anyway, Nicholas Lemann is the author of many books, great books. One is Promised Land, The Great Black Migration and How It Changed America. Big Test, The Secret History of the American Meritocracy, and Redemption, The Last Battle of the Civil War. He's also written about affirmative action in various contexts in the Academy and for the Academy and for courts sort of over the years. He also was the Dean of the School of Journalism at Columbia from 2003 to 2013. Peter Beinart is was the editor of the New Republic, and he is currently a frequent contributor to The Atlantic. He had published 3 books recently that I know of. There may be more. One is The Good Fight, about the United States and the war on terrorism. Icarus, about American hubris, and The Crisis of Zionism. Should I say anything more before we begin?
No.
You know, Peter also teaches here.
See some of my students.
So that's one of the great things about Graduate Center. So what I thought I would do, sort of as moderating this, because this is their time, is to ask them to talk a little bit initially about sort of how they got here. We know how they got to where they are sort of professionally. And then I'd like them to talk about sort of how, about their particular sort of approach to political writing in whatever dimension they understand that for themselves. And then to talk about their understanding of their role in American public life as political writers. There are particulars to this list, but there are those are the 3 topics that I have asked them to say something about, and I will try and make them both comfortable and committed to paying attention during as they make their remarks, and so we'll just go from there. Okay. So Nicholas first.
Okay, so I'm answering the question of how did I become a journalist?
Yeah.
Okay. I grew up a long way from here in New Orleans, and I didn't know any journalists when I was growing up, but I got very entranced with journalism just from reading magazines. And when I was, so I sort of formed this ambition to become a journalist by the time I was maybe 15 years old. and didn't know how to do it. So one day there's this sort of now dying part of journalism, but then very exciting and new, called alt weeklies. And there was an alt weekly in New Orleans called the Vieux Courier. And I went to their office, and which was, you know, in a sort of loft at the back of the French Quarter, and just walked in and said, I would like to be a journalist and work for you. And they said, this is when I was 17, and they said, okay, we'll make you a deal, we'll give you a tryout on writing an article, and in return, you'll be in charge of, this is another dated thing, but they had these coin boxes where you put in a quarter and take out the paper, and so I had to promise to be the person who went and filled all the coin boxes every week, and in return they'd let me write an article. So basically, ever since then, which was a long, long time ago, I've been continuously on deadline with some piece of journalism or other the whole time, and still am. I ended up, let's see, I mean, I don't want to take you through all these long, boring things. The last about 30 years, more than 30 years, almost 40 years, have been split between two national magazines. First the Atlantic, then the New Yorker, where next spring I'll be 20 years as staff writer there. Is that enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, and just sort of why did it interest you? I mean,
Why did journalism
Yeah.
interest me? Well, I thought it just seemed like a really, I mean, I liked reading journalism. It seemed really exciting. I grew up in a very traditional society, and the idea that you would be allowed to kind of say what was actually going on in print just seemed, you know, or in public, just seemed incredibly cool to me and unfamiliar. And the idea of being a reporter where you could sort of go around anywhere you wanted and meet people and interview them and ask them questions. I just thought all that was just incredibly exciting. This was a moment when there was something called the new journalism that was appearing in magazines, and I was reading that as it came out, and this is all, I know this sounds like ancient history, there were these things called head shops, where hippies would go buy things, and you
Heads.
yeah, and you could go to the head shops, and they'd have these magazines like Rolling Stone and so on, and there you'd read these very exciting dispatches about whatever was going on in the world, and I just thought, wow, that's what I want to do, you know.
Yeah. And okay. No, that we'll get into this later as it
So
folds
it was, like, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying I wanted to be a public intellectual. I wanted to, you know, write about political theory or anything like that. At that point, I just thought, wow, I'm going to go be a reporter and like go talk to people and then write what they say. You know.
Just one last. Did your undergraduate education, you went to Harvard, help you in this? Or?
Well, I went to Harvard, and you know, I was basically about 2/3 of my time at Harvard was spent at the student newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. So that's definitely a big part of my launch into journalism.
Great.
Well, Nick Lemann is one of the people who I kind of came of age reading, actually, part of a kind of I feel like a generation of people like James Fallows and Michael Kinsley, who had an impact when I first started, you know, falling in love with reading magazines. I think I thought I wanted to be a professor, just because that's like kind of the only thing that people on my father's side of the family ever seemed to be able to do, like in 4 different continents, but that's kind of, they were all professors. So I thought, well, I'd be a professor, and I was interested in politics, and I was interested in history and, my parents were South African immigrants, and so South African politics were kind of the constant subject of conversation and fighting in our family, and that made politics seem important. But then when I was lucky, when I was at college, I took a seminar with a great historian, David Bryan Davis, historian of slavery, and there were a couple of other students in that class who went on to be historians. So was lucky enough in college to actually see some a real historian and some historians in training.
And by the way, his father's a journalist, or was a journalist.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And I realized then that I wasn't a good historian because I just didn't have the patience. I like to jump to conclusions after a little bit of research. And I like small research, big conclusions, rather than a lot of research, little conclusions, which I realized kind of is what you're supposed to do. And then weirdly, when I went to graduate school, the fact that I wasn't going to work as an academic, I thought at that point, well, I'd be an African historian. That was really what interested me. But then it weirdly turned out that as it happened, while I was there, like a not very good graduate student in African history, they brought in this guy to be the top African history job in the UK, the job is actually, bizarrely enough, I don't know they can still call it that, Cecil Rhodes Professor of Race Relations. That's the job, Cecil Rhodes Professor of Relations, believe it or not. That's actually the job. And he was my cousin, same last name. And so it was like, all right, well, this is ridiculous, because then I knew he was really a good historian, and I wasn't. So I had started doing journalism kind of on the side summer before I went to graduate school, and I realized that there was a certain kind of journalism that I really thought had all the best aspects of academia, because you could think about ideas, and you could try to write about things that were happening at the moment with some kind of context, putting them in some larger, but then many more people would read them than happened in academia. You could write them much faster. The writing could be fun and engaging, and you could have big arguments with people, and it just seemed to me much more attractive and I thought I was better at it because I was kind of glib and was better as a peddler of secondhand ideas. I was good at taking ideas that real scholars had and then packaging them and thinking about how they connected to current events and then kind of sending them out quickly into the world. And that was kind of the better niche for me. So yeah, and I've been doing it ever since.
I think one of the things that's useful for us to think about is how the form in which one writes about politics really affects also the content in which that appears in what is written. And what I'd like to ask each of them now, and then we'll go through this two more cycles of this, and then we'll open it up, is that Nick has written substantive articles for the New Yorker, and of course all these important books, but he's also regularly taught a course at the journalism school called Evidence and Inference. And one of the things that I found interesting about it, which is validated by a recent review of this book by an ex-editor of The Guardian. It's a review that was in the London Review of Books, Russ Budger or something like this. Anyways, but he said that Russ Bridger. But anyways, he said that one of the things that's important to do when you're a journalist is to forget what you know in order to learn about what you need to write about. And this is one of the things that Nick has talked about, among other things, in his course, Evidence and Inference, at the J School. And I wondered if you might talk about, sort of how you understand your task, or how you have understood your task in teaching that course.
Okay, I guess I started out, and so this I hope will be clear, something that has happened to me in kind of recent decades that I had no idea what happened to me when I started out to be a journalist was I started having a lot to do with academics and particularly social scientists. And I got really, I can go into detail if you want, but I'll skip it for now. I got really, really interested in social scientists and started dealing with them a lot as I did my work. And it occurred to me as I was working as a journalist that there was a kind of way you could be trained to be a journalist. I'm giving a very shorthand version of a big chunk of my life. So,
Got at least 5 minutes.
if you imagine, there's two kinds of logic. There's narrative logic and analytic logic. The logic of journalism is narrative logic. The logic of social science is analytic logic. So journalists often make mistakes. I love writing narrative, but journalists often make mistakes because narrative logic can lead you to sort of get things wrong in the larger truth sense. So I got very interested in, could you find a way to train journalists to be more adept at analytic logic without abandoning narrative logic? And that's really, so when I came to Columbia Journalism School as dean, and this course is actually part of an entirely new degree program that we created. So we created a whole new degree program with a whole new curriculum, whole new faculty, et cetera, all kind of under this general heading of making journalism more, sort of intellectually and methodologically and analytically sophisticated and adept, and tying it to what went on in the rest of the university. And that's a big part of my life, doing that. And so the evidence and inference is basically a sort of epistemology course for journalists. We just had our last class meeting of the year yesterday. So after almost 15 years of it, we sort of got all the moves down, and it teaches you kind of how social scientists and real scientists think, how much of that you can port into journalistic practice, and then we do a series of specific techniques that I think are useful to journalists, including literature reviews, ethnographic research, oral history interviewing, and statistical literacy. So that's a real quickie version of what's been a big chunk of my life, but that's what we're doing. Does it have an effect? It definitely has an effect on me and the way I practice journalism. It definitely, I don't think, has become a widespread credo of a lot of journalists, but I feel like with my students, the first early years, they would say, why are you teaching us all this stuff? This isn't journalism. And more recently, I get more of people writing me saying, gee, I'm thinking back to evidence and inference class, and it changed the way I covered something.
Great. So Peter, I know that.
I would add, just as something that was a big part of both of our lives as journalists, one of the things that really, really got me onto this was the Iraq War. So if we want to talk about that.
Yes, it's a topic that Peter, I'm sure, is happy to talk about, right?
Well, it's actually written. I wrote 2 books which dealt with it, so I actually kind of am, yeah.
Well, never mind. I'll let you present your own engagement with that phenomenon. But as you perhaps talk about this in your answer to my question, you did mention in your self-description of how you came to be, or came to do what you have done, that history was always very important to you, but you knew that you wanted to use it in ways that wasn't used by historians, so you could address a larger audience. And what kind of decisions did you make what kind of decisions do you make when you decide, oh, no, that's not important for this piece? No, that part of history is not important. What I want to do is something that's more important for my audience here.
So I guess the first thing is that you are generally, at least for me, generally it has to relate to something that is of the moment, right? So kind of like there's this is something that kind of most journalism, at least the stuff that I write, is usually in response to some events that are happening. So it's kind of like, that's different, right? It's not kind of I'd never really write anything that's kind of, delving into some historical point for its own sake. It's always because, well, maybe that helps put what's happening now in context, or helps us see it in some way. So that's one difference. The second is that I'm not doing very rarely. I mean, there have been from some of my books. I've done kind of archival, primary source research, but generally with the kind of articles that I write, columns or even essays, I'm just looking at secondary stuff. So it's not really, doesn't really kind of meet the kind of, in that way it's different than obviously what historians would do. I might kind of try to understand the secondary source literature on a certain topic, and I often will talk to. Generally, what I'll do is I'll find something. So now I'm writing. I was interested in right now. I was just writing a piece. I'm interested in the. There's a little bit of a spat about that's happened over the last week, 2 weeks, about controversy about Beto O'Rourke and the fact that he took a bunch of money from fossil fuel companies.
Oh.
And some people who like Bernie Sanders said, this is bad, and then some people at the Center for American Progress said, no, don't attack Beto O'Rourke, and then they said, well, you take fossil fuel company money too. Anyway, so it got me interested in this question of a few years ago, it wouldn't have been considered really prohibitive to be a Democratic Party nominee to take money from just about anywhere, any corporation pretty much. The Democratic Leadership Council, which was the most important kind of Democratic Party organ in the 1990s, had not only Philip Morris on their board of trustees, but the Koch brothers. So I was just interested in how that political culture has changed, and I think actually just particularly over the last 2 or 3, since 2016, a lot. And so anyway, I got interested in kind of the longer history of different moments in the Democratic Party and their relationship with corporations. And I found a book by a guy at University of Texas, actually a political scientist, about different ideological eras in the Democratic Party, and he has an idea about how the Democratic Party moved away from a kind of more class antagonist, anti-corporate kind of rhetoric at the beginning of the Cold War. Anyway, so then I talk. What I'll generally do is I'll read something, but I'll also talk to the person and try to kind of talk to them in a way that helps me try to make sure I understand what they're saying and think about how that's relevant, and then I'll write something which is an effort to kind of make an argument that draws on make an argument about what we can learn about something today that draws on the kind of work that other people have done about the past.
Okay. One brief question about that, the work that you do as a writer in engaging in these political controversies, and then I want to ask a question to both of you. But as you're trying to contribute to these public debates,
Mm-hmm.
you not only are sensitive to various sort of winds in Washington, but also to how your own work is going to be perceived.
Right.
And that possibly could have an effect on what you write. And do you have a sense of, it's just, a matter of trying to hit the right note, or are you concerned about having to make compromises with the truth or with political knowledge, as you write these pieces?
I guess, so first of all, I try to think, is this thought obvious? Will somebody who follows the news somewhat find anything fresh or, in this? Can I provide some information they won't be aware of? Can I make an argument that, or is this just kind of too obvious for people? But is it also relevant enough for people? Will it seem important to enough people? So those are two things I think about. I think that there are, there's definitely, I don't know. I think that different publications have a different culture. This culture is not necessarily, these things are not explicit, but they're implicit about the ways you think about things and the ways you kind of frame arguments. The Atlantic, if you compare the Atlantic to the Nation, right? The Atlantic is more likely to talk about American foreign policy in terms of mistakes rather than crimes, right? That's not something that's like, it's just, there's just something in the ethos. But it's not that you couldn't, but it's just that it's a culture that the different publications have different kinds of cultures and are more, I would say, some are kind of more oppositional. Some are kind of, see themselves as an ideological kind of opposition to power as their mission, and others see themselves as maybe more kind of, maybe kind of friendly critics or a certain kind of way, maybe, I don't know. Certainly I write probably about maybe half or a little bit less than half, somewhere a third of half of my writing is about Israel-related, Jewish-related stuff, and that's a subject on which I'm much more acutely aware of the potential political ramifications of what is, what I could say, and so that's one where that's always kind of front of mind. That's part of what makes it interesting to me. It's a little bit of a game in terms of like testing the limit sometimes of how you can say things and what you can say, and at what cost.
That's great. One of the things that's come up, shall we say, in the last 3 years, right, in a big way, in a way that's really unprecedented, except perhaps in terms of 2002-03, and then also, with the entry into with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, has been the role, and the Johnson administration has been the role of lying in politics, and in particular, what counts, and this is more so recently, right? I mean, what counts as a fact in politics, in understanding politics. I mean, one of the things that I actually served as or worked as a legal assistant to welfare recipients and people, and I was an advocate for them in administrative court a long time ago, and the opposition, namely the welfare agencies, tended to make their arguments with the phrase, "Oh, the facts speak for themselves," which it seems to me they never do. But if they never do, then what's a fact? And how are we to understand facts? Now, that's obviously something that you consider in your course, and I wonder if you could speak about that and how it relates perhaps to the current, maybe we can then start talking about other things, but as it relates to the current political environment. But I mean, do you see facts as having sort of different valences depending on the different form in which they're presented, or is there something that's solid out there?
Okay, so I have a lot of opinions about this, and I'm compressing.
Right. Yeah.
Headline: the whole conversation about post-truth and fake news is 98% bullshit. It's just wrong. Yes, Trump is exceptional in his willingness to lie as a head of state, but this argument has been around forever, going back to the Republic. Please, don't walk to your bookstore and read Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, and then the successor book, The Public and Its Problems. These are almost 100 years old. He's making all these points exactly the same. He says, everything's changed. There's this new thing called radio, and there's this new force called propaganda and public relations, and it's very, very, disturbing because, we used to have fact-based politics, and now it's all based on illusion and images and lying. So, I'm really, really skeptical that something new has happened. So I want to divide this into two parts, okay? One, what has actually observably changed, as opposed to, things feeling different? It must be said, I was just writing somebody a letter about this. So in my lengthy life, basically, whenever Republicans are in power, liberal intellectuals always say we're in post-truth. I'm just going back, there's this, my colleague Ron Susskind wrote this sensational article in which he quoted Karl Rove talking about the reality-based community, and that was a big finding. Jonathan Schell in the 70s wrote a book called The Time of Illusion, all about, during the Reagan administration, there's all this writing by liberals about spin and illusion and an actor is president. It's kind of like the sports fan thing where, if your side's winning, then you don't mind if the ref makes a bad call. But, if your side's losing, you're all about process and so it generally seems to liberals like there's this sort of fantasy that if rational politics would always produce liberal leaders, and so therefore if it's not, there must be something wrong with the system or the process, and this is one thing. So what has actually changed in the information environment? One, we deregulated broadcasting. I would note, and that happened in the 80s, I would note that that was applauded, as I remember, by essentially 100% of journalists and almost all people on the left. But it seems like ancient history. It was illegal in broadcasting to express really strong, hot-blooded, style, or even Rachel Maddow style opinions. And there was, this thing called the Fairness Doctrine, this thing called the Equal Time Rule. So by government fiat, and this goes back, way back to the Walter Lippmann days when radio came along and propaganda came along, and developed nations were terrified of broadcasting. So they made them either state-owned, or heavily regulated to prevent propaganda and misinformation. And by the 80s, we decided, boy, we're past that, and we want to have a much freer information environment in which everybody can say everything. And so when the table was set for cable and then for the internet, that's how it was set, to privilege free speech. Free speech is not the same as information. If you have free speech, you will have massive amounts of misinformation, and you will have massive amounts of hateful, insightful speech that you don't like. So you got to kind of decide what you want there. Meanwhile, in the internet age, the space devoted to sort of professionalized journalism that has epistemological standards has radically reduced. So, when I was a kid, you had like journalism, professionalized journalism, and then around it a sort of smaller outer core of sort of unprofessional, wild assertion, etc. And now the journalism core has shrunk and the periphery has increased. I have a really easy time as a teacher telling my students, there is such a thing as objectivity, which I'm happy to define in my way. There are facts, there is the truth, and with all due humility, you should strive to get closer to them. So that's kind of not the problem, in my opinion. The problem is how do we enhance the space in which those kind of values are honored? And then the really tough question is, do you want to go to, the European place and just say, we're not okay with the